Hey guys, Adam Menner here from Varsity Gym in the Business of Strength. In this video, I'm going to talk about 2 ways that you can program for speed over the long haul. Now, in this video, it's pretty lengthy. This is part of our VH Free Speed series here at Varsity House, but I talk about 2 ways that we really adhere to programming and why we prioritize speed. So you guys can find all of that stuff below in the video. If you have any questions or comments, make sure you pause it, you're taking notes in the video to get the most out of it. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love great feedback, so go ahead and comment below. Enjoy the video.
Programming speed. So now we're going to get into understanding the intensities, understanding the volumes for each phase, and how that corresponds to what you guys should be implementing with your athletes. So organizing speed and stress, section A here. How to organize stress. We talked about this a lot in our free June 26th annual VH Speed and Performance Summit. But it's something to be noted here again. When you look at each phase of the sprint, so when I look at acceleration accumulation, when I look at power intensification, when I look at absolute speed realization, I'm looking at it from a stress standpoint. We're going to talk about the nitty-gritty X's and O's of training, but it does not matter if you cannot do this one job. If you cannot organize stress, you're done. Your programming does not matter. So looking at acceleration accumulation, we know this is lower CNS work. We know that it's higher PNS fatiguing because of all the aforementioned reasons above. We know we need more oxidative work. We need a more aerobic work to help replenish our alactic system to accumulate greater work capacity in bouts of force that we experience when we're trying to create torque during those first 0 to 2 steps, 0 to 5 steps, if you will. So here, lower CNS fatiguing because again, we're not experiencing the most motor units used that we experience in later phases such as absolute speed realization. Higher PNS fatiguing because we're experiencing greater ranges of motion plus resistance when looking at weighted sprints, when looking at power variations that are weighted and unilateral variations. So we know that we're going to have more localized tissue damage, more localized soreness. This is why we need to improve aerobic work here to help recover and help with those bouts of training. Moving on to power intensification. We know that we need moderate CNS stress. This is again because now ground contact time is decreasing, force is increasing, moving at higher velocity. So this is going to tax us more neurologically. Now, moderate PNS fatigue, this is because shorter ranges of motion. I'm not taking that joint and lever through a full range of motion, so I'm not going to get as much concentric and eccentric action as I'm going to experience in earlier phases of acceleration. This is now more alactic and lactic. You would ask, well, why lactic? Because of the anaerobic speed reserve, right? Being able to repeatedly sprint at sub-max speeds is technically lactic work. If I'm not running my best time, that's prolonging time. And prolonging time is tapping into a different energy system that we talked about in our stress and energy system development. Now, moving on here to our absolute speed realization, this is the highest CNS stress. This is why we talked about in the aforementioned lecture that I want to remove volume. So I'm trying to remove volume here because I know that it's the most stressful thing that I'm going to experience. Not a lot of PNS fatigue because of shorter ranges of motion, the removed volume. And now this is just completely pure alactic work. Why though? Because there's an inverse relationship between time. I'm no longer at sub-max speeds. I'm running as fast as I can. I'm trying to accumulate the best time. So I need glycogen readily available to be able to generate energy and perform that alactic task, which is sprinting, moving at max velocity. So understanding stress here and how to undulate stress and remove it is extremely important. So the key takeaway for this lecture is knowing that in earlier phases, you can handle more volume, you can handle greater ranges of motion, and you're gonna need the oxidative work to help recover between those bouts of sprinting sessions. In power intensification, I begin to build upon my acceleration. It's becoming more stressful. I'm going to experience less PNS fatigue, but I'm going to be in better shape because I have greater work capacity developed in my earlier phases. As I go to my absolute speed realization, I know that this is extremely neurologically taxing. I experience low PNS fatigue, and as a byproduct of that, this is completely alactic, so I need to ensure that my nervous system is ready to recover in between these bouts of training. Looking here, organizing speed and stress part 2, how to manage volume. So this is the number one way to mitigate fatigue outside of intensity. Managing volume in earlier phases, our distances are going to be between 10 and 15 yards, 300-yard volume max per given session, or over the course of the week is what we recommend. So example, if you sprint 10 yards, that's going to potentially be 30 10-yard sprints, but you can't perform all of those in one session. So you might need to perform 15 sprints on day 1, 15 sprints on day 2, but these also include warm-up sprints. So this is just total exposure to the task at hand. This is the volume range that you should adhere to. Moving on to power intensification. 15 to 25 yards is the distance, so we know that it's a little bit further. So for here, your volume is going to be between 250 and 300 yards. So you would say, well, that's the same as acceleration accumulation, but it's not, because my distance is greater, so my total sets per workout will be less. If I'm sprinting 25 yards in this power intensification phase, well then if that's 250 yards per week, that's only 10 total sprints that I'm sprinting in that week for improving my sprint exposure. Moving on to my absolute speed realization. Now my distances are the absolute furthest and my volume is the absolute least. So 150 to 200 yards, using the example of a 40-yard sprint, you're probably not sprinting more than 1 to 2 of those in a given week. And they should probably be on the same day to help allocate and kind of confine that experience of stress, that experience of CNS fatigue that's going to transpire over the next 48 to 72 hours. But if I'm running lower distances, 20 to 25 yards, I can accumulate a little bit more volume here, maybe 3 to 4 sprints of 25 yards, because what we found is as you begin to exceed these volume numbers, your times and your weekly averages will go down from week to week here. So that's important, understanding stress and understanding your volume before you can even get into exercise templates and exercise selection for your programming. When looking at the data, as I alluded to before, will speed really help me get to the next level? Will understanding the data really help me get to the next level? And behind here we have images from our Fusion Sport. In the next two, we're going to show and deep dive for you guys how this actually works and how you can begin to organize your programming with your intensities, with your loads, and with your weekly volume. So moderating intensity. This is now taking the 13-week block structure that we have talked about. So we have our 13-week blocks. Now we look at our acclimation, weeks 1 through 2. What's our objective? We've talked about this: increasing tissue resiliency, building work capacity, building the engine, and accumulating as much strength potential as possible. Intensities are going to be a lot lower, again, because I'm not running maximally here. So these are sub-max intensities, so I can handle more volume. Ranges of motion are the longest. Weekly volume, we're going to accumulate the most. Density, determined by Altis and Stuart McGill, is the total reps. This is where we're going to be able to handle the most sets and reps. And then stance is unilateral. This refers to what's happening kinematically in the weight room that we need to be prioritizing. Week 3, we test across the board, as you guys can see here. Now, during acceleration and accumulation, this is an extension of our acclimation. So this is our intro to weighted power work via resisted sprints and also some weighted unilateral work. This is now intensity improves because our distances are now increased. Ranges of motion. Now our ranges of motion are a little bit longer, but they go to a little bit shorter as our distances improve. Weekly volume is moderate and medium. Our density between 4 to 12 reps per session. So depending on a sprint, I would never perform 10 to 12 weighted sprints in a particular session. So when you look at here, our density, that is in a given week of how much volume we're trying to attain. Stance is unilateral still, because we're still in those earlier phases of acceleration and developing unilateral strength for all the reasons we've mentioned before. This is why we still stick with this stance in the weight room. Now when you see our transition to power intensification, the next 3 weeks, now we're really increasing the intensity of our power work. So now what we're looking for is intensity is going to improve with both our speed, our power, and our strength. Our ranges of motion are decreasing. Now we're trying to get rid of volume to help mitigate fatigue. Our density is going down. But like we talked about before, now we want to utilize bilateral movements to help match what is being experienced from a sprinting and power standpoint. Lastly, as we get into our absolute speed realization, just to recap everything that we've been talking about, now this is where we're increasing maximal CNS output. We're developing, or working at, I should say, the highest intensities. Ranges of motions are the shortest, volume is the less, density is the absolute less, and now bilateral and shorter ranges of motion in the weight room to help match this curve. Lastly, we test here in week 3. So testing in week 3 here is now where we get our comparison of what we did in week 3. Now we have a good sample size. Have we improved between 4.8 and 8.4% respectively? So now, this is something that we have worked on a lot of. So now this is where we pull everything together. In my opinion, this is probably the most valuable piece of information or graph that you guys can utilize. So this is what took a lot of trial and error to see what works. So working in this graph from left to right from where you guys see it, you can see now our phase, our acclimation phase. We know the weeks, the distances, intensity. But notice load. Load refers to how much load on the body. Are we working at body weight? Percentage of body weight. 0% during acclimation. Now, look to the far right, beyond weekly volume and density, we're looking at miles per hour in averages for prescribed distances. So we have novice, intermediate, advanced. What is the miles per hour between 5 and 10 yards that we know that they're trending in the right direction? So I might have a novice that has a poor mile per hour through 10 yards. So I know in the following phases, they might need to spend more time in acceleration building that engine. Same thing with intermediate, same thing with advanced. As I move on though, I look at my split times. This is per prescribed distance. So an individual who has a poor split time, I know that this is probably a biomechanic issue, but it's also a strength deficiency issue because those first 0 to 2 steps are going to tell me a lot about where this individual is, because 25% of my max velocity could be achieved in step 1 based off split time, and 40% of my max velocity could be improved by step 2. This is also based on split time. So there is a direct relationship between split time, strength deficiency, and mechanics when working on the start of the sprint. As we move on beyond testing, now we look at our acceleration accumulation. These are some of the numbers that we've played around with a little bit that are extremely important, and there's some overlap here that is very, very important to help ensure that we don't expose people too quickly to loaded sprints at given distances, at given velocities. So I'll use an example. During acceleration accumulation, we have found that starting at 50% of one's body weight is where they're going to get a lot of good work in, where their averages can still improve week after week via miles per hour and split times. Now, moving on to the next week, week 5, we transition quickly to 40%. So now it's a little bit less weight, same volume, same distance, but we're looking at miles per hour. So I know that if their miles per hour are still improving in terms of averages week after week, we can keep decreasing load as we get exposed to greater velocity. However, as we mentioned before, in our assessments and in our testing, if we see that their times are decreasing, well, then we have to go back to the drawing board. And Jacob talks about this a lot in the data section. So I know that they might need to spend more time at 40% because they need that work to build that certain physical quality that we're looking to train. And again, if you guys have access to this, this is why going back through the force velocity and the load velocity is going to matter. Because if you see the strength if you see the strength deficiencies, then you'll know that this person needs to spend more time building their engine. Maybe they need more time at 50%. They need more time at 40%. They need more time at 30%. So you need to repeatedly test after you do your weighted sprints. And we do this by testing unweighted sprints almost in a contrast fashion to see, are their averages improving? Now, look at the transition from acceleration accumulation to power intensification. Intentionally, we found that utilizing that 30% range of one's body weight for a further distance, 15, maybe 20 yards at 30%, is important. they need a lot of exposure in that transition time. This is kind of considered that attaining velocity phase, because this is where a lot of injury can occur. Injury can occur when you don't have the capacity, the technical ability, or the frequent exposure to higher velocities with a given load. Knowing this information is why we transition and we utilize a certain load, sometimes 3 weeks at a given percentage. As you move through power intensification, what you'll begin to see is we use 20% quickly as a good buffer between now our 10%. So between our power intensification and absolute speed realization, that 10% zone there, this is pivotal. This is very important as it pertains to getting them to experience that distance. Try running 10% of your body weight through 20 to 30 yards. That's a lot of load in relation to body weight, not at 50% in regards to the force experienced at running at that distance, that there could be, again, further chances of injury. So we have a lot of overlap here, and we spend a lot of time there for athletes as we bring them through this percentage profile or percentage program, if you will, to get them to, again, run unweighted sprints at 20 to 40 yards. So I hope this makes sense. So understanding how to utilize it. When looking at load, that is what we are doing per density. But then we time unweighted sprints through the same distances that we are looking for miles per hour. We do 3 of them every single time to gain the average and to see, is that average improving over time? And if that average is not, well, we go back to this individual. What deficiencies did they have in their profile? What percentages were we working at? What adjustments do we need to make in order to ensure that they're progressing week after week? So this is extremely important that you guys understand how to go about doing this. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and comment below in the section of comments on our course, and we'll answer you as soon as possible.